Now let's take a deeper dive into the conflict in Israel and how it is impacting American politics, particularly that coming 2024 election. Joining me to discuss this is former White House Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor at Bondi Partners, Mick Mulvaney. Mick, first of all, thanks for coming on. And reactions to the crisis in Israel from leaders around the world are under the microscope. But Donald Trump is being criticized for his comments at a rally about Hezbollah. Have a listen to this.
Gee, I hope Hezbollah doesn't attack from the north, because that's the most vulnerable spot. I said, wait a minute. You know, Hezbollah is very smart. They're all very smart. The press doesn't like when they say it.
Now, some people are saying that this is a bad look for Donald Trump there to be talking about Hezbollah in those terms. How damaging is this? Is this getting a broader play than just sort of the confines of Twitter?
Yeah, James, it's always, impossible to predict when if Donald Trump will ever take that final step and just go a bridge too far and finally start turning people against him. I don't think this is going to do it, but he's pushing up against the envelope. In fact, in the last, 12 hours here, he's also come out saying critical things about President Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, which again is really, really pushing the envelope with his core base of supporters. Do I think it's going to change the outcome of a primary election? No. But Donald Trump really is sort of taking things as close as he possibly can to try and turn people against him. We'll see if it happens.
Well, Mick, I mean, this is an interesting thing that always happens in politics. When there's crisis, when there's a war, people generally wind up sort of coming back in the direction of the people in power if the people in power don't wind up screwing it up too badly. The Biden administration response has not been horrible to this. They've sent military assets to the region, and they've been saying all the right things. Is there a chance here that Joe Biden, or the Democrats rather, the Biden machine, could start to turn some of their fortunes around off the back of this?
Yeah, there's a chance. Keep in mind, in American politics, foreign policy very, very rarely determines any outcomes. I guess there was an exception maybe during the Vietnam War and maybe a little bit towards Afghanistan, but not much. So typically, foreign policy doesn't drive voters in this country. That being said, Joe Biden has been operating under this cloud ever since the pullout from Afghanistan over a year ago now, and rightly so, because it was badly, badly mismanaged. If he can manage this better, and he is managing it better, maybe he might be able to convince people that Afghanistan was not part of a pattern, it was the exception. So they've done a nice job here in the first 72 hours. You have to give them credit. Of course, actions will always speak louder than words, especially in international politics. So the next 2, 3, 4 weeks are going to be absolutely critical, not only for what's happening in Israel, but for what's happening in the Biden administration. But we'll wait and see. So far, Biden has done better in the last 72 hours than Trump has.
But at the same time, though, a lot of people are saying, and I think quite correctly, Mick, that the world has become a much more dangerous place under Joe Biden. We've seen all sorts of mayhem around the world since they took power. And we've also had this little detail that Biden was told about the war breaking out in Israel at 7 a.m. the morning after the news broke everywhere else, essentially suggesting that his team chose not to wake him up. People should be concerned about this, shouldn't they?
They should, and that has not received nearly enough attention here. I picked up on it as I watched his press conference. He said, when I woke up this morning, they told me right away. And I'm like, oh, my goodness, that means they didn't wake the president up. It's always a big issue in this country, especially during elections, James, about the 3 a.m. phone call. I think Hillary Clinton actually did a campaign ad about that when she ran.
Actually, Mick, let's have we'll have a look at that ad right here.
It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. But there's a phone in the White House and it's ringing. Something's happening in the world. Your vote will decide who answers that call. Whether it's someone who already knows the world's leaders, knows the military, someone tested and ready to lead in a dangerous world. It's 3 a.m. and your children are safe and asleep. Who do you want answering the phone?
I'm Hillary Clinton, and I approve this message.
So there's that ad, Mick.
Yeah, so clearly Joe Biden wasn't awake for the 3 a.m. phone call, or better put, his staff chose not to make the call. That's not an accident, James. That doesn't happen sort of by mistake. There's no people running around the White House at 2 a.m. going, should we wake the president up or not? That was a decision that the National Security Advisor and the Chief of Staff made in advance, which is we are not going to wake the president up. you can expect to hear about that again and again and again in the 2024 campaign, regardless of who the Republican nominee is, because that is a major problem. The voters in the United States expect the president to lead in times of crisis, not to sleep.
And I'm glad you brought up the National Security Advisor, because this really does bring up a question that I've asked and we've talked about a lot on this show about who is really running the White House. Is this Jake Sullivan who's now actually running the whole response to Israel? And Biden is, again, as we've talked about in other circumstances, just a figurehead.
Yes and no. There's actually some indication now just in the last couple of hours. In fact, I just saw some reporting out of Washington, D.C. before I turned on this computer that President Biden actually rewrote a couple of the speeches that he gave in the last couple of days to make the language tougher. This is a more assertive president than I think we've seen in a long time, because typically he's not even capable of getting through a written statement without screwing it up too badly. But he does seem to be asserting himself here. That being said, I still come back to the fact that the chief of staff and the national security advisor are probably running the day to day, but it does look like Joe Biden is actually paying attention here in a way he has not on previous issues, for example, Afghanistan.
But there's also some other problems, too, behind the scenes, because along with all of the questions about why the Bidens have pumped all of that money back to Iran, not just the $6 billion from those seized assets, but lifting sanctions and a lot of other things as well, there's a lot of concern around the Biden administration's former special envoy to Iran, who was placed on leave earlier this year for mishandling classified material. People are saying that he had a permissive stance towards the Tehran regime, and this comes amidst also reports that there was a massive influence peddling operation in Washington by Iran. This almost feels sort of like the Cold War, when people were concerned that Moscow was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Is this kind of the same thing now, but with Tehran?
It's hard to say. There's certainly a lot of questions that are being asked. There's a lot of questions about connections between high-ranking members of the Biden administration and these pro-Palestinian groups have coming out in the last couple of days as well. I prefer to look, and I know you do, James, at the actions louder than words. What are the actions? Under the Trump administration, Iran was selling about 400,000 barrels of oil a day. Under the Biden administration, they're selling about 3 million barrels of oil a day. That's a lot of money that could go to things like funding terrorism. So look, the Biden administration has a lot of questions to answer. There's no question about it. One of the questions, by the way, we've not even talked about yet is, where were the American intelligence agencies? Why did we miss this as badly as it looks like we did? Who's running that organization in the Biden administration? A lot of really harsh questions here. Going to be a long time for know the answers, but this will bring nothing like a really nasty war with a good friend to bring these types of things into focus.
Mick, we're going to have to leave it there, but we've got a lot of questions to talk about next week as well, and I look forward to speaking to you then. Thank you so much for your time.